This is Jake Adams, CEO at Simplify EDU.
And I'm Danielle Griggs, a tutor coordinator at Simplify EDU, and you're listening to Educators at Heart.
This podcast is for parents and students interested in peering behind the curtain to get to know the authentic journey we're all on as students of life.
Every week, we'll interview a different educator we know so that they can share the unique experiences that have shaped their perspective on the most important things students should know on their journey to higher education. Let's get started. Today, we have the privilege of having Omar Hamki on the podcast. Omar is one of our academic tutors at Simplify EDU and a recent medical school graduate from the University of Alabama School of Medicine. Alongside his career in medicine, Omar also holds a Master's of Public Health in Environmental Sciences, a Master's of Science in Biomedical Health and Science, and many other interests, including 3D modeling, architecture, and history. Jake has a stimulating conversation with Omar about the value of cultivating an interdisciplinary approach to learning. Let's jump in.
Omar, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here and speak with us about the value of cultivating an interdisciplinary approach to learning. So something that we like to get started with, just to get to know you, is understanding a little bit about your background. So we'll get started. So can you tell me where are you from originally?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Initially, I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where my family still is. Went to high school there. Went to undergrad at Georgia State University. So my family is also of a Syrian background, so I kind of get an experience of two worlds. Being born and raised here, but having visited overseas a few times. Yeah, so for my undergrad, I went to Georgia State University, majored in neuroscience.
Yeah, so can you tell me a little bit about your favorite teacher growing up? And can you tell me what they were like? And that's just a question that we like to ask everyone because we're all, benefiting from educators at some point in our lives.
Right. So one of my most memorable teachers was a after-school tutor of mine. He was my math tutor. And so we kind of had some very informal 1-hour sessions after school, and just kind of having that one-on-one time, you're able to really tailor your questions to get them answered in a way you wouldn't really in a public school setting. And that just comes with the challenge of having multiple students to one teacher. And then the other teacher I really appreciated was my history teacher in high school. So she was a very open-minded. She kind of brought the subject to life in a way that I didn't really experience in other classes. And the other thing I kind of noticed growing up, so reflecting on those days, is they really did a good job of blending different teaching styles. So they both spent time overseas, and so they picked up teaching styles that were pretty common overseas that I've tried to incorporate.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to be able to pass that on. In terms of, your educational background in, how you've gone from so many different fields, right? From neuroscience to environmental science, biomedical health, and now, medicine. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey and that background that you have, and kind of how you made the decision to go through all those different realms of study?
Yeah. So starting undergrad, I always had it in the back of my head I wanted to do medicine eventually. It's pretty standard, I would say, in the U.S. that if you're a pre-med, pre-nursing, pre-dental student, you're going to major in biology. And I found it at that point, it was a very dry subject. So I wanted something a little more unique. And at the time, Georgia State had just started their neuroscience program. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to I think we were like the second or third cohort to start their neuroscience class. After I finished undergrad, I went into environmental health, and I've always had this interest in kind of environmental development and how urban development kind of conflicts, or in some cases it can complement like the natural environment, and that kind of also blends with my interest in architecture, and these are kind of side hobbies that I've tried to get some educational background in. And so after I finished that, I was planning to continue with medical school. So I ended up going the biomedical route and then coming back into medicine.
Awesome. And what impact would you say your own curiosity has had on your education and your career so far?
Um, I would say so. Having developed curiosity in a lot of different subjects that I initially saw as pretty dry or boring, it really kind of helped in first of all my teaching. So teaching, I feel like, is a very good way to review your own material and study. So this is especially true for like history and a lot of science classes and math. These tend to be very like cut and dry. Just teachers will just give you the facts and you're expected to just memorize them. But there's a element of kind of fostering curiosity in students that I feel like I've benefited from in teachers or professors that have been able to kind of foster that curiosity. And now I've tried to implement that whenever I'm teaching myself.
Yeah, I find myself like, just generally going down a rabbit hole oftentimes about things that I'm curious about. So, yeah, it sounds like, that's something that you try to create for students and also have probably experienced yourself. I know that you had worked on a patented innovation um, with, I think it was the node of Odie.
Oh yeah,
Um,
sphincter of Odie. Yeah.
yeah, and so you when we talked about it a while back, you had pulled together a lot of different disciplines in order to make that happen. And for our listeners, can you quickly kind of recap? Because I realized I jumped into it and didn't explain what you had put together. In you sort like, is it proper to say this is an invention that you uh,
It's it's I don't
created?
actually know what the proper term would be, but it's sort of it's an artificial sphincter that works without relying on a power source. So it more relies on uh, so the chemistry of the bodily compartments, I would say. So because you're dealing between an acidic and a basic chamber, so you can kind of capitalize on that. Anytime there's sort of a difference in nature like that, you can capitalize on that difference. So building off of the difference in pH, you can now use polymers that react to pH. So you can get like actual kinetic movement from an acid or a base without having to use a battery or something that's going to need to be replaced eventually.
Cool.
So this kind of is the idea is just to kind of mimic a muscle.
Yeah, that's awesome. Can you tell me a little bit about like how you took an interdisciplinary approach with that invention, essentially?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't have a formal background in like biomedical engineering, so I but I do have kind of the curiosity of like how things work. And there was a show I can't remember on what channel it used to air, but it was How It's Made or something like that. And they would literally just kind of follow along like a little 15-minute clip of how like a Dorito is made, like a chip or like a watch or something. So I always kind of had that like curiosity of like how certain things are built. Um, but I didn't have kind of a formal biomedical engineering background. So I feel like if you have the curiosity, you have just enough to kind of have the conversation with people about it. And so you're able to communicate with actual biomedical engineers and be like, how practical is it to do this? Or is this a feasible idea? And like with the idea I'm talking about, I discussed it with a few biomedical engineers and they're like, oh, this is very doable. And they kind of pointed me in the direction of like, oh, we have these things that are coming out now, like these certain polymers that would really work well with this idea. So um, I was fortunate enough that I had the curiosity and I had enough people around me that were familiar with the field that they could guide me. But I feel like a big part of it is, people say, oh, you got to start somewhere, which is true, but to also not drop it just because you got a couple of no's or it seems like it's hopeless. A good thing with the internet now, especially, and I'm sure ChatGPT does a good job of kind of guiding you and creating some basic framework that you can work off of, and then get professional input from other disciplines.
Definitely. And so, can you share your story of how you developed an interest in multiple disciplines? I know you're handling a lot of things. You're very interested in science, history, literature. Like you've expressed that to me, but how did that come about?
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I will say like I was very distracted. So I wouldn't say I developed a lot of interest early on in high school. But I will say my high school history teacher did a really good job of kind of fostering that initial interest in history. And then, believe it or not, a lot of podcasts. There's the Dan Carlin podcast. He starts with like ancient Persia and goes into the ancient Greeks and all these other time periods in history that you slept through in your early education. But then you really start to realize that the story of humanity is a lot longer than you thought. So that's specifically for history. For um, science and stuff, I feel like that more is a curiosity of how things work and like, oh, can I do it better? Is there a way to do this better? Like, um, so it does take that kind of, you have to keep that curiosity, especially when you're younger. I feel like just because you're as a kid, you might not have really capitalized on it early on, but if you can foster that curiosity and have it carry you on into adulthood, you can really capitalize on it then when you're able to reach out to people and make actual moves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, keeping that curiosity alive is super important, and it's kind of what allows you to essentially like cross pollinate
Right,
in a
right.
lot of the different interests that you have. Um, can you tell me a little bit about how sort of like, your interest in history and literature have shaped the way that you approach science and the learning that you do there?
Yeah, so with history, I would say uh, science a lot of times can be a very cut and dry subject, um, but it helps to learn kind of the history of how we learn the science. Like everyone heard the story of Isaac Newton sitting under a tree and an apple fell on his head and he discovered gravity. And then you grow up and realize that is all like a legend that never actually happened. But kind of realizing like, oh, why did they develop this? Or how did we discover that the sun is however hot it is? Like, kind of how do we discover like the elements that are in planets if we don't actually go there? And then you learn, oh, you can take the light and there are these kind of shadows that you can study, and each element has its own pattern. So you start to really appreciate how humans kind of the human ingenuity, how it really developed, and how we developed our understanding of the world around us. So history can really complement science in a very powerful way. And then literature, having to work on like research papers in science, once you get really involved, you have to work on your grammar. So you become more appreciative of things like that. Especially in this day and age, I feel like when emojis are really starting to seep into our daily vernacular, so you have to still hang on to that proper way of communicating.
Can you tell me a little bit about, your hobby of ancient coin collecting and how that's enriched your understanding of history and even your ability to teach it?
Yeah, so this was kind of I can't actually recall exactly how I developed the interest, but I think I was studying like Western Roman history or something, and then I got an ad for some coin, and it was like it was a very like worthless denomination. So I forget exactly what it was worth at that point in history. It was probably like a penny or whatever, but it was very affordable, and it was like $20 or something. So I was like, oh, $20 to get like a piece of history. That's really cool, and I ordered it and everything, and it came with little uh, certificate of authenticity. I just thought it was very cool to have like something that was very tangible, so that it kind of creates that this is a coin that's passed through like people that were alive like 2,000 years ago, literally use this exact piece of metal to exchange for goods. It was that kind of started it, and then I realized like, oh, coins started in ancient Lydia, and like there was actually like a start point where you can start collecting coins, and that's as far as our coin history goes, as far as we know. Up until they discover some other ancient civilization we don't know about, but um, so it kind of creates these like I was talking about these anchor points that you can reference back in history, and I find it fascinating that you can actually own them legally
Yeah,
in this day and age. So
that's awesome. There's so much there in terms of like, what can we learn about, the past by going ahead and actually buying a piece of it. So
yeah, yeah.
that's really And then, what would you say to students who are, interested in finding ways to combine their interests? Like, what would you say, they could do to make their own learning, interdisciplinary, or like try to benefit, in unintuitive ways?
Yeah, so I would recommend starting small. One of the benefits with the internet is you have a very big, body of you could say documentaries, podcasts, whatever it is that interests you, just to kind of build your own curiosity, even in your downtime. Well, like I do a lot of driving between like cities that are like 2 or 3 hours apart over the weekends, and I use that time to like listen to a podcast about like some history or some like new science article that's just come out or something like that, where it's not very formal. And I feel like that's one of the issues is you're sitting in class a lot of times from like 8 to 5, and it's these formal 1 hour structured periods of learning. And learning doesn't, in my opinion, it's not always going to be a formal process. A lot of times it's very informal, and you um, you really kind of have to appreciate nuance in something, but in order to do that, you can't be there's a sort of tension that comes with a formal learning environment that you don't get in kind of a conversation, like a day-to-day conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Would you say that the formal structure is kind of like what allows students to maybe grasp things in a way that can carry them from point A to point B, but it's more that conversation and sort of informal style that keeps curiosity and the spark for love of learning alive?
exactly. I would say that's very well put. It's more of a like you said, take it from point A to point B. That's a very formal approach. But if you want them to genuinely carry the torch forward when you're not there, I feel like you need to also create that organic curiosity that's really going to last. And that comes from kind of the informal conversations.
Definitely. And then what would you say are some of the ways that you've learned to sort of like take unrelated subjects and understand the connections between them? Because I think that's like one of the ways that you really start to l- learn more deeply by combining different lessons that you learn in one place and applying them somewhere else. So like, how have you done that for yourself and even for your students?
Yeah, so I would say I'll give the example in like in medicine right now. There's a company called Sketchy Medical, and what they do is they will take a whole body of drugs. So you have to learn like hundreds of drugs at medical school, which can be very boring and very difficult to do if you're uh, I don't want to say interested because that's not really true, but it's difficult regardless. So what they do is they do a good job of creating these images that are each image is based on a drug, and you can recall the image instead of having to recall like the name of a drug and some boring chart. You can actually just be like, oh, they had a cat on this page, and the cat represents this, so I know this drug has this quality or this property or something
Mm,
like that. So kind of I think signs of a good teacher is being able to capitalize on something like that, and really not just teaching students that way, but also teaching them to take that step themselves and kind of develop their own study habits that don't have to be kind of rooted in what we think of as classical studying, which is just like index cards or flashcards or something like that. So kind of blending in different styles.
yeah, I actually watched a YouTube episode not too long ago, and one of the things that this guy was talking about is essentially that you really don't have an understanding of something until you can kind of like diagram it out in as few words as possible and say, okay, this is how this idea connects to that. And these things are related and it's all this one big web. And when you create that, like that's kind of where you really understand how things interrelate and are, you know, you're proving to yourself that you get how it all works together. Because so often like note taking or formalized learning is just like it's linear, but like you're saying, I don't think learning in most cases is linear. It's more like you kind of have this hodgepodge of experience
Right.
that all connects. So how do you integrate different teaching styles and methodologies, to essentially give a more comprehensive learning of a subject?
Yeah, so this kind of touches on a subject we discussed of kind of formal versus informal teaching styles. Um, and I've tend to notice that a lot of I don't know if this is a actual way to break it down, but I'll call it Western teaching versus Eastern teaching styles. I'll find a lot of uh, Eastern teaching styles heavily emphasize kind of informal sessions. They have very informal ways of teaching, and classrooms aren't always going to be. This is probably not as true now because the world is kind of all heading towards the same direction of how we do things. But historically, they've had ways of teaching that might not create that kind of formal barrier that a lot of students struggle with. So I try to use that as much as I can. So I guess my main point would be to explore other teaching styles that are done in other countries, because a lot of times I don't want to say they do it better, but they will do it in a way that might actually work better for certain students here, um, and vice versa. So like if you're teaching overseas, you can incorporate some Western teaching styles.
Definitely. Yeah. There's not just one way to do it. In terms of, you know, the advice that you'd give parents looking to facilitate an interdisciplinary approach for their students, is there anything that you might say to parents to help sort of like create that environment for that type of learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say just kind of reflecting on my own life, some of the most memorable days I've had were kind of going to the museum with my family growing up, and uh, there are things that you will do with your kids that you will think them as, they're very trivial, but they will carry them on like in their own memory, and they will reflect on those days and be like, oh, that's what this was, or that's what this represented, or very things that things that you might not even be interested in. I even remember like days when we'd have somebody bring like model airplanes to school, and they would teach about lift and drag and all this stuff that I didn't even like understand it as a 8, 10-year-old kid, but kind of creating those memories that they can also use as anchor points and they can reference back later in life. It I would say the effect of that is very often underestimated, and doing something that's in person versus watching a video. Not to say watching a video is not effective, but I would say it's definitely more effective if it's an in-person activity. Um, and then the other part of it is even at home, you can kind of take a day to do some sort of activity of building something or repairing something, just to foster that curiosity, like we said earlier.
Yeah. That's definitely an awesome thing to facilitate for students. I think that in so many ways, those early memories, they lay that foundation for familiarity and for being open and receptive to things later. So, yeah, that's I think a great way to approach that. In terms of wrapping up here, so something that we like to ask all of our guests is essentially like, what are some simplified lessons that you've learned that by sharing, you think you could help accelerate learning for everyone who's listening here? So could you tell me a little bit of like, what do you think are some of the most important takeaways that you've had related to just your own life lessons, and then maybe one lesson with trying to combine all your different interests within your studies?
Yeah, there is I'm going to butcher this quote. I don't actually know if it's even authentic, but there's a quote that's attributed to Einstein all the time about like judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree or a monkey by its ability to swim, something like that. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
Yeah, definitely.
yeah. So just kind of keeping that always in mind when you're dealing with a student that you think like, oh, this is hopeless. Like there's no way they're gonna make it in life, or um, just because they don't have an interest in something you're interested in, that does not mean that it doesn't mean that they can't develop an interest in that subject, and B, it doesn't mean that they have no interest in anything. regarding education. So they might have an interest that you yourself haven't really fostered yet, and you can't really relate to them on that level. So that like I've even with classmates that I've had like followed kind of through like in middle school, like um, they had certain strengths and I had my own, but oftentimes you'll find that you will either cross paths at some point and you're now, you know, kind of sharing a common goal, or you've kind of flip-flopped completely and you have the interests that they used to have, or and I don't mean like life interests, but like strictly educational interests. Whether they're pursuing a field in medicine or architecture or something that you thought you wanted to go into. Um, so that would just kind of be my little 2 cents.
Omar, thank you so much for your time today and for all that you've had to share. We really appreciate you just giving us your perspective on the importance of interdisciplinary learning and what we can do to facilitate more of that for ourselves and our students. So thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we hope to see you next episode. Thanks so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to our show for future episodes. See you next time.